On that morning at the plain of Chaeronea, what rose on the horizon was not the sun, it was a sea of steel. 120,000 soldiers, cavalry, archers, and scythed chariots that hurled storms from their wheels. The Roman army, standing against this vast force, looked like nothing more than a handful of dust. Everyone believed Rome would be buried in this valley forever. But General Sulla held something more powerful than a sword in his hands, a pickaxe and a plan. No one noticed how those silent trenches would bring a storm of 120,000 to its knees. So how did Sulla drive an army 4 times his size into total collapse? How did the scythed chariots end up neutralizing their own lines? Now, we dive into the story of one of history's most impossible victories, a great knot tied by intelligence alone. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Do you think this victory was an act of military genius, or was it the price of an enemy's blind faith in their own numbers? Share your most interesting theory in the comments. The night before the battle, no fire burned on the Roman side of the plain. Not because there was nothing to burn, because Sulla had ordered it. Every torch extinguished, every cooking fire smothered. 86 BC, the plain of Chaeronea, and 30,000 Roman soldiers sat in total darkness and waited, not for morning, but for an order that most of them did not yet understand. The darkness was not comfortable. It was the particular darkness of a Greek summer night in the hills above Boeotia, dense, warm, filled with the sound of insects and the distant, unignorable presence of 120,000 enemy soldiers camped 3 miles to the north. Their fires were visible from the Roman position, an enormous orange glow spreading across the horizon like a second sunset that refused to go out. Sulla stood at the edge of his command position and looked at that glow for a long time. He was not a young man, not anymore. The campaigns had taken that from him, the easy confidence of youth replaced by something harder and more precise. He had been fighting his entire adult life in one form or another, and he had learned what most commanders learn too late or not at all, that the battle is almost always decided before it begins, not in the clash of lines, not in the moment of impact, but in the hours before dawn, in the decisions made when every instinct says rest and only the mind says move. He turned from the fires. "Bring me the guides." There were 3 of them, local men, Greeks from the villages around Chaeronea who knew this terrain the way they knew their own faces. They had been brought to Sulla 2 days earlier by one of his cavalry scouts, and he had spent those 2 days asking them questions that his officers found strange. Not about the enemy's numbers, not about their cavalry formation or their supply lines, about the mountain. Specifically about Thurium. Thurium Hill rose on the eastern edge of the plain, a sharp, rocky prominence that commanded a view of the entire battlefield. The Pontic army under Archelaus had recognized its value immediately and placed a garrison there, several thousand soldiers positioned on the high ground with eyes on every Roman movement below. As long as Thurium was in Pontic hands, Sulla was being watched. Every formation, every adjustment, every preparation seen and reported. More importantly, if Archelaus ever chose to push soldiers down from Thurium at the critical moment, they would hit the Roman right flank from above and behind at exactly the worst possible time. Sulla had been thinking about Thurium for 2 days. He looked at the 3 guides now. One was old, perhaps 60, with the compact, weathered body of a man who had spent his life on these hillsides. The other 2 were younger, brothers, who stood close together the way brothers do when they are nervous. The eastern face of Thurium, the rock path your people use, can men climb it in darkness?
The old guide looked at him carefully before answering. Men who know it, yes. Men who do not know it, they fall. Then you will lead them. How many can move quietly on that path? Quietly? Perhaps 200. More than that, and the noise carries. Sulla looked at the hill for a moment. 200 men against a Pontic garrison of several thousand. The arithmetic was, on the surface, disastrous, but Sulla was not thinking about arithmetic. He was thinking about what 200 men on top of that hill at first light would look like to the soldiers who were not expecting them. 200 is enough. They do not need to fight. They only need to appear.
The column moved out at the second hour of the night. 200 soldiers, selected for their steadiness and their ability to move without speaking, following 3 Greek guides into the darkness of the eastern hillside. No torches, no metal striking metal. Every piece of loose equipment wrapped or removed. They moved in single file, one hand on the rock face, feeling the path more than seeing it. It was not fast. The path climbed at an angle that made the legs burn after the first 100 meters, and the darkness meant every step had to be considered before it was taken. A loose stone sent skittering downhill produced a sound that seemed, in the silence, catastrophic. The column would stop, wait, listen, then move again. Sulla waited below. He did not sleep. He sat at the entrance to his command tent, a habit now, the night before any engagement he considered serious, and thought about the morning, about Archelaus, about the plan, which had more moving parts than he would have preferred, and which depended, as all plans ultimately do, on men doing precisely what they were told at the precise moment they were told to do it. He thought about the trenches. 2 days ago he had done something unusual. He had ordered his soldiers, tired soldiers, soldiers who had marched hard to reach this plain and who deserved rest before a battle, to dig. Not a small ditch, extensive fieldworks, channels cut across the approaches to the Roman position, angled to channel and redirect rather than simply block. The reaction had been what he expected. A centurion from the 3rd cohort, a veteran named Marcus who had been with Sulla for 11 years and had earned the right to speak plainly, had approached him the morning the digging began. "The men are asking, General. We've marched 4 days to fight. Why are we building walls instead of sharpening swords?" Sulla had kept his eyes on the work. "Tell them they can put down their shovels and stand in front of the chariots instead, if they prefer." Marcus had said nothing further. The digging continued. The trenches were not for defense in the conventional sense. Sulla had seen the Pontic order of battle. He knew what Archelaus intended to do with the scythed chariots, those terrible weapons, wheels fitted with long iron blades, designed to be driven at speed through infantry formations and cut men apart before they could react. On open, flat ground, against infantry that had never faced them before, they were genuinely devastating. They had broken formations before. They had broken entire armies before. They required one thing to function: speed. A scythed chariot at full speed was a catastrophe. A scythed chariot at half speed was a wagon with blades. A scythed chariot that had been forced to slow by broken ground, by channels cut at precise angles across its approach, was a target. The trenches were not walls. They were a speed control. He had not explained this to the men digging them. He rarely explained. Explanation before the fact invites argument. Explanation after the fact, when the men who dug the trenches watched the chariots stumble into them, invites understanding. He preferred understanding. Dawn came slowly to Chaeronea. The plain lightened from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning, and the Pontic camp came visible in stages. First, its fires still burning from the night, then the dark shapes of its tents, then finally the movement of its soldiers beginning the preparations that armies begin when they know the day will be violent. On Thurium Hill, the Pontic garrison had been awake since before dawn. Standard procedure: stand to at first light, watch the Roman position below, report any movement. What they were not watching was the rock face behind them. The 200 Romans reached the summit of Thurium approximately 1 hour before full dawn. The old guide placed his hand on the arm of the column's commander, a tribune named Gaius, young but controlled, and stopped him just below the crestline. He made a gesture. There. The Pontic soldiers were 20 meters away, looking out over the plain, completely unaware. Gaius waited until the light was sufficient, until the Pontic soldiers on the hilltop would be able to see clearly when they turned around. Then he gave the order. 200 Roman soldiers rose above the crest of Thurium Hill and stood against the morning sky. What happened next was not a battle, it was a panic. The Pontic garrison turned, saw Roman soldiers behind them, above them, between them and any possible retreat, and the calculation that every soldier makes in that instant produced a single overwhelming answer: move. Not forward, not toward the Romans, down. Down the western face of the hill, toward the plain, toward the Pontic main army that was just beginning to form up for the morning's engagement. Thousands of Pontic soldiers pouring off a hillside they had held with absolute confidence the night before, running in disorder into the rear of their own formation. Archelaus, watching from his command position, saw the disruption begin before he understood its cause. By the time he understood it, it had already spread. Panic is not rational. It does not wait for an explanation. It moves at the speed of fear, which is faster than cavalry, faster than messengers, faster than any order a commander can give to stop it. The first domino had fallen. But Sulla, watching from below, was not yet satisfied, because Thurium was the beginning, not the battle. And the battle, the real battle, had not yet begun. He turned from the hill and looked at the trenches running across the plain in front of him, at the Pontic chariots forming up behind the disrupted infantry. He looked at the ground his men had spent 2 days cutting open. Now came the test.
The trenches had been Sulla's first decision. Not his formation, not his cavalry positioning, not the allocation of his reserves. The first thing he had done upon seeing the plain of Chaeronea was walk it alone. No staff, no officers, just the general and the ground. And when he came back, he had summoned his engineers before he had summoned anyone else. That had been 2 days ago. Now, with Thurium falling behind him and the Pontic main army beginning to reorganize after the shock of the hilltop panic, those 2 days of labor were about to be tested. But to understand what the trenches meant, what they really meant beyond the geometry of channels cut into Greek soil, you had to be there when they were dug. You had to see what Sulla asked of his men and what his men thought of being asked. It had begun on the morning of the second day before the battle. The army had arrived at Chaeronea after a march that had taken the last reserves of energy from men who had not been given adequate time to replace them. They were not broken. Roman soldiers of this era were not easily broken, but they were the particular kind of tired that makes everything feel heavier than it is, that turns every additional demand into an injustice. Sulla had looked at his army and seen all of this. He was not unsympathetic. Sympathy, however, was not what the situation required. He called his senior officers. "We begin field works this morning. 2 channels across the western approach, 1 along the northern line. I want them 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Every man not assigned to picket duty digs." The silence that followed was the particular silence of men who have heard something they cannot immediately process. Lucius Licinius Murena, commanding the left wing, spoke first. "General, the men have been marching for 4 days. If we work them today and fight tomorrow, then they will be tired when they fight, yes. The morale will recover when they see what the trenches do to the chariots. Begin the work."
By midday, the mood in the Roman camp had moved past exhaustion and into something uglier. Not mutiny, Roman discipline did not break that quickly, but the particular anger of soldiers who feel they are being used without being respected. Groups of men rested on their tools and spoke in the low voices that carry precisely because they are meant to carry. A centurion from the second cohort of the 6th Legion, a broad man named Decimus, who had fought for Sulla in 3 separate campaigns, put the feeling into words with the directness that only a man who has earned his position through violence can manage. "We came here to fight Pontics, not to plant crops. My men's hands are bleeding. Their backs are finished. If we fight tomorrow like this, we fight badly." Word traveled, as words do in armies, and reached Sulla within the hour. He did not summon Decimus, he went to him. He walked to the section of trench where Decimus's men were working or had stopped working, and stood at the edge and looked down at the men standing in the half-dug channel with their tools in their hands and their eyes on their general. He let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to be felt. Then Sulla: "Put down your tools." The men looked at each other. Sulla: "Put them down. If you will not work, do not work. Go stand in front of the Pontic chariots instead. They will be here tomorrow morning. Stand in the open and let the wheels come. That is also a choice." No one spoke. Sulla: "Or you can finish the trench, and tomorrow the wheels will come to this ground instead of to your bodies, and you will watch from behind it while Archelaus tries to understand what happened to his greatest weapon." He crouched at the edge of the trench. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, not softer, but quieter, the kind of quiet that men lean in. "I know you are tired. I am tired. Every man who has ever won anything worth winning was tired when he won it. Dig." He stood. He walked back to his command position without looking behind him. The digging resumed.
The chariots were the reason. Everything about the trench system, its angles, its depth, its precise placement across the western approach to the Roman line, had been designed with one specific weapon in mind. The scythed chariot was not a subtle instrument. It was a weapon of pure kinetic violence, a 2-horse vehicle fitted with long iron blades extending horizontally from the wheel hubs, designed to be driven at maximum speed directly into an infantry formation. At full gallop, those blades did not cut so much as they erased. Men who could not move fast enough simply ceased to be in the space the chariot passed through. The requirement was speed. This was not incidental, it was fundamental. A scythed chariot at full speed was catastrophic. The same vehicle at half speed was manageable. Soldiers could step aside, the blades moved slowly enough to read, the horses could be targeted. The weapon's entire lethality existed within a narrow band of velocity. Remove that velocity, and you removed the weapon. Sulla had understood this. More precisely, Sulla had understood that the plain of Chaeronea, as it existed naturally, was perfect chariot ground. Flat, unobstructed, offering a clear run from the Pontic's formation directly into the Roman center. Archelaus would use the chariots early. It was the obvious move, the move that had worked before. And on that open ground, they would hit the Roman line at full speed and tear it apart before the infantry engagement even began. The trenches changed the ground. Not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately obvious from a distance. 2 channels cut across the western approach, angled to force any vehicle crossing them to slow, to break its rhythm, to arrive at the Roman line not as a thunderbolt, but as something that could be dealt with. The channels were not wide enough to stop a chariot entirely. They were precisely wide enough to interrupt it. That precision had required 2 days and bleeding hands and a general telling his exhausted soldiers to dig or go die. Now, standing at the edge of his position, with Thurium falling behind him and the Pontic formation beginning to reorganize, Sulla looked at the channels running across the ground between him and Archelaus. They were not impressive to look at. 2 lines of disturbed earth, 4 feet wide, 2 feet deep, positioned with geometric care across an approach that still looked from a distance like open ground. Archelaus could see them. He had scouts. He knew the channels were there. What he did not know, what no one on the Pontic side had yet understood, was that Sulla did not need the channels to stop the chariots. He only needed them to slow them down. And slowing them down was enough.
Archelaus gave the order at the first hour of full morning light. It was, by every conventional measure, the correct decision. The Roman line was visible across the plain, 30,000 men, outnumbered 4 to 1, positioned behind a modest earthwork that had not yet been tested. The Pontic formation was recovering from the shock of Thurium, reorganizing with the practiced efficiency of a professional army that had absorbed disruption before. The chariots were ready. The ground between the 2 armies was open. The moment was, by all appearances, exactly right. Archelaus, send the chariots. There were 80 of them. That number matters, not because it was large or small, but because 80 scythed chariots, properly deployed on suitable ground, represented a genuinely decisive weapon. Archelaus had used them before. He knew what they did to infantry formations that had never faced them. The sound alone, the particular metallic screaming of iron blades spinning at speed, the thunder of horses pushed to their limit, was enough to break men before the vehicles arrived. Fear traveled faster than wheels. By the time the chariots reached a line, half the work was already done. He watched them move out from the Pontic formation with the satisfaction of a man releasing a weapon he trusts completely. The chariots accelerated. For the first 200 meters, everything was exactly as it should have been. The horses found their stride, the drivers leaned forward, the blades began their rotation, that particular blur of iron that caught the morning light and turned it into something threatening. The Roman line, watching from across the plain, showed the first signs of what Archelaus expected: movement, adjustment, the visible unease of infantry facing something they could not fight with a shield. Then the ground changed.
The first chariot hit Sulla's channel at approximately 3/4 speed, not the full gallop it needed, but fast enough that the driver had no warning before the front wheels dropped into the cut. The vehicle lurched. The horses stumbled, lost their coordination, the precise synchronized rhythm of a chariot team dissolving in the space of a single stride into 2 animals pulling against each other in confusion. The chariot did not stop. It came through the channel, lurching and slowing, but it arrived on the other side at half the speed it had entered. Half speed, the critical threshold, the number that transformed a weapon into a problem. Behind the first chariot, the others were hitting the channel in sequence. Some drivers tried to adjust, pulling their teams left or right to find a crossing point that didn't exist, because Sulla's engineers had cut the channel at the precise angle that made avoidance impossible without a complete change of direction. Others pushed through as the first had done, emerging slower, their formations broken, the tight geometric arrangement that made chariot charges effective dissolving into a scattered line of individual vehicles moving at varying speeds in approximately the same direction. They were no longer a charge, they were a procession. On the Roman side, Sulla had given his infantry one instruction for this moment. It had been delivered the previous evening, quietly, without drama, passed down through the centurion structure until every man in the line understood exactly what was expected of him. When the chariots come, open the line, let them through, close behind them. It went against every instinct. Infantry holds its line. That is the fundamental rule, the thing that is drilled into soldiers from their first day of training, because a broken line is a dead line. To deliberately open a gap in the formation, to step aside and allow an enemy weapon to pass through felt like surrender.
Several centurions had said as much when the instruction came down. A centurion named Publius, commanding the 3rd century of the 2nd cohort, had put the objection plainly to his superior the evening before. Publius: "We open the line, we die. That is what happens when you open the line." His superior, a tribune who had fought with Sulla long enough to trust the plan even when he didn't entirely understand it, had answered without hesitation. Tribune: "We open the line, the chariots go through. Then we close it, then we kill the chariots from behind." Publius: "And if the chariots turn?" Tribune: "A chariot cannot turn at speed. That is the point."
The first chariot reached the Roman line moving at less than half its original velocity. The blades were still spinning. The mechanism did not stop simply because the horses had slowed, but spinning blades on a slow vehicle are a different proposition entirely from spinning blades on a vehicle traveling at full gallop. The Roman soldiers in its path did what Sulla had told them to do. They stepped aside. Left file 3 paces left, right file 3 paces right. A gap opened in the Roman line, precisely wide enough for a chariot to pass through, and the chariot passed through it, into the empty space behind the Roman formation, where there was nothing to cut and nowhere to go, and the vehicle's momentum carried it another 30 meters before the confused horses began to slow on their own. The gap closed. 200 Roman soldiers turned to face a chariot that was now behind their line, moving slowly, with its driver looking back over his shoulder at an army that had simply moved out of his way and then moved back. The javelins came first. Pilum, the heavy Roman throwing spear, designed to punch through shield and armor, absolutely lethal against an unarmored horse at close range. Both animals went down almost simultaneously. The chariot stopped. The driver, suddenly without momentum or horses or any of the things that made his vehicle dangerous, was a man sitting on a wooden platform surrounded by soldiers with swords. It did not take long. Behind him, the rest of the chariots were coming through the line in 1s and 2s, and behind each one the same sequence repeated: the gap opening, the chariot passing, the gap closing, the javelins, the horses, the driver. What had been Archelaus's opening blow, the weapon he had trusted to shatter the Roman line before the infantry even engaged, became, in the space of perhaps 12 minutes, a systematic slaughter conducted entirely on Roman terms. Archelaus watched from his command position. He had seen the channel. He had known it would slow the chariots. He had calculated that slowed chariots would still hit the Roman line with sufficient force to disorder it. He had not calculated on Roman soldiers stepping aside. Archelaus: "What are they doing?" His adjutant had no answer, because what the Romans were doing had no precedent in Archelaus's experience. You did not open your line to a chariot charge. That was not something armies did. The principle was foundational. You held or you broke, but you did not deliberately make a hole and invite the weapon through. Sulla had simply decided that the foundational principle was wrong and had spent 2 days making sure his soldiers knew it. The last of the chariots came through the Roman line and was dealt with in the same manner as the first. The plain between the armies was littered with the evidence of the failure: dead horses, overturned vehicles, the iron blades that had seemed so terrible 20 minutes ago lying still in the Greek dust. 80 chariots, the greatest weapon in Archelaus's arsenal, gone in 12 minutes without breaking a single Roman formation. Sulla looked at the wreckage. He looked at the Pontic infantry now advancing behind where the chariots had been. 60,000 men in phalanx formation, Ceresus leveled, the kind of mass that had conquered most of the known world and was not going to be stopped by a trench. The chariots were finished. The battle was just beginning.
The phalanx came forward like a wall that had decided to walk. 60,000 men. Sarissas, the Macedonian pike, 18 feet of ash and iron, leveled at the same angle, the same height, moving at the same pace. From a distance, it looked less like an army advancing and more like the plain itself rising and moving westward. The sound it produced was not the clash of individual combat, but something more fundamental. The deep, rhythmic percussion of 60,000 sets of boots striking Greek soil in approximate unison, underneath which ran the lower sound of wood and metal and leather moving together, the whole vast organism breathing as one. The Roman soldiers watching it come had seen difficult things in their careers. This was a different category of difficult. The problem was mathematical, and it was immediate. The sarissa outreached the Roman gladius by approximately 14 feet. The gladius, the short thrusting sword that had made the Roman legionary the most effective close-quarters fighter in the world, required a man to be within arm's reach of his enemy to function. The sarissa required nothing of the sort. 5 rows of Pontic infantry could level their pikes simultaneously, creating a forest of iron points that extended well beyond the reach of any Roman sword. To get inside that reach, a Roman soldier had to pass through 14 feet of lethal space, while the man holding the pike stood safely behind it. In the open field, on flat ground with the phalanx moving at full cohesion, this was not a tactical problem. It was an execution. Murena, commanding the Roman left, watched the phalanx close the distance and felt the specific sensation of a man who understands that the thing coming toward him cannot be stopped by the means available to him. He sent a rider to Sulla. "Murena, the phalanx is at 200 meters. Our line cannot hold contact. The sarissas are too long. What is your order?" Sulla received the message without taking his eyes off the advancing formation. "Tell Murena to give ground, slowly, due west. The line does not break, it retreats." The rider looked at him. "Go."
What Sulla had seen, what he had seen 2 days ago when he walked the plain alone, was a feature that required a particular kind of attention to notice. The western edge of the plain, toward which a retreating Roman center would naturally move, was not flat. It appeared flat from a distance. Up close, in the specific light of early morning, you could see what the ground actually was: interrupted. Shallow ridges, dry creek beds, patches where the soil had eroded unevenly over decades, leaving surfaces that were navigable on foot, but that played havoc with any formation requiring geometric precision. The phalanx was the most geometrically precise formation in the ancient world. Every sarissa at the same angle, every man at the same interval, every row maintaining its relationship to the rows in front and behind. That precision was the source of its power, and its absolute dependency on flat, unobstructed ground was the source of its vulnerability. Sulla had spent 2 days thinking about how to move 60,000 men from flat ground to broken ground without them noticing until it was too late. The answer was simple: give them something to chase. The Roman center began to give ground, not breaking. That was the critical distinction, and maintaining it required every senior centurion in the center formation to simultaneously project calm they may not have entirely felt. A breaking line runs, a retreating line steps. The difference in appearance from the Pontic perspective was subtle. The difference in outcome was everything. Archelaus, watching his phalanx advance against a Roman center that appeared to be yielding, read the situation the way it was designed to be read. "They cannot hold. Press the center. Full advance." His adjutant relayed the order. The phalanx increased its pace. This was exactly what Sulla needed. A phalanx moving faster is a phalanx paying less attention to its footing. The Roman center continued its measured retreat west, angling slightly north, drawing the Pontic advance along with it the way a magnet draws iron without touching it. 100 meters, 150. The ground beneath the advancing phalanx was beginning to change, though the change was gradual enough that no individual Pontic soldier could have identified the precise moment it happened. The first sarissas began to drift. Not dramatically, a matter of inches, a front-rank soldier stepping slightly wider than his interval to avoid a shallow depression in the soil, his sarissa swinging fractionally out of alignment. The man behind him adjusting, the man beside him shifting. Small corrections, each one individually invisible, collectively producing a change in the geometry of the formation that was, from above, unmistakable. Gaps were opening in the sarissa wall. Not large gaps, not yet, but gaps nonetheless. Spaces between the pike points where, if a man were fast enough and close enough and committed enough, the geometric protection of the phalanx dissolved, and what was left was simply a soldier holding a very long spear who had no room to use it. Sulla saw the gaps from his position. "Signal the center, stop the retreat, hold!" The Roman center stopped moving backward, stopped, dressed its line, and for the first time in the engagement turned to face the phalanx that had been pursuing it. Now on ground of Sulla's choosing, at an angle Sulla had determined, with a formation that was no longer the wall it had been 200 meters ago. A centurion named Gaius, commanding the first century of the 4th cohort in the center, saw the gap forming directly in front of his position. He had been a soldier long enough to understand what he was looking at. He turned to the man behind him. "You see the space between those pikes? That space is ours. When I move, you move, not before." He watched the gap, watched it widen by another fraction as the Pontic soldier on his left took one more step onto uneven ground. Then he moved.
The phalanx that Archelaus had sent forward was no longer the instrument he had launched. It was the same men, the same equipment, the same numbers, but it was fighting on ground that had unmade its one essential quality, and without that quality, it was not a phalanx. It was 60,000 men standing very close together, holding very long spears, and the Romans coming through the gaps between those spears were not impressed by the length. Archelaus watched the center engagement deteriorate with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had been certain about. How did they get inside the line? His adjutant had no immediate answer, because the answer, that Sulla had spent 2 days identifying a patch of broken ground and then spent the battle walking 60,000 soldiers onto it, required a kind of thinking that Archelaus had not considered necessary against an army a quarter of his size. The phalanx was not broken, not yet, but it was compromised, and a compromised phalanx on broken ground with Romans inside its reach was a very different problem from the one Archelaus had planned for. He had other options. He still had his cavalry.
Archelaus still had 10,000 cavalry. This was not a small thing. 10,000 cavalry, properly deployed against an infantry line already engaged at its center, represented the kind of force that ended battles. The arithmetic was straightforward. The Roman right flank was holding, but it was holding without reserves, without depth, without the kind of redundancy that absorbs a heavy cavalry strike and survives it. If Archelaus could push his horsemen around the Roman right and into the flank, better still, into the rear, the center engagement became irrelevant. A Roman army taken in the flank and rear simultaneously does not fight its way out. It dissolves. Archelaus understood this. He had been watching the Roman right for the better part of an hour, measuring its strength, calculating its depth, looking for the moment when the center engagement had consumed enough Roman attention that the flank could not respond adequately. That moment, he decided, had arrived. Archelaus. The cavalry. Right flank. Full envelopment. I want them around the Roman line and into their rear before they can shift a single cohort. On the Roman right, the tribune commanding the flank, A young officer named Scipio, his third major engagement, experienced enough to read what was coming but not experienced enough to feel anything other than afraid when he read it, saw the Pontic cavalry begin its movement and sent a rider to Sulla immediately. 10,000 horse moving against our right. We cannot hold this. I need reinforcements or I need permission to contract the line. Sulla received the message. He did not send reinforcements. He did not grant permission to contract. He sent back 4 words. Hold, Hortensius is coming. Scipio read the message twice. He looked at the 10,000 Pontic cavalry closing on his position. Then he looked at the hills behind the Roman right flank, the low ridgeline that had sat empty and irrelevant all morning, offering nothing except a view of the battle and the particular useless beauty of Greek hillsides in summer. He did not see Hortensius. He told his men to hold.
Quintus Hortensius was not famous yet. He would become famous later, as an orator, as a lawyer, as one of the great advocates of the late Roman Republic, but on this morning at Chaeronea, he was a military officer commanding 5 cohorts of infantry that had not moved since before dawn. They had been positioned behind the ridgeline on the Roman right 2 nights before the battle, moved into place in darkness, and instructed with a simplicity that left no room for interpretation. When do we move, General? When the Pontic cavalry commits to the flank, not before. If you move before they commit, they pull back and we have shown our hand for nothing. Wait until they are fully extended. Wait until turning back costs them more than going forward. And if they reach Scipio before I move? Then Scipio has a difficult few minutes. He will survive them. Move when the cavalry is committed. Hortensius had spent the morning behind the ridgeline, listening to a battle he could not see, making the judgment that Sulla had placed entirely in his hands. He watched the dust cloud on his left, the signature of large cavalry in motion, and he measured it. Speed, direction, density. The Pontic cavalry was moving fast, committed, leaning into the envelopment with the confidence of a force that believes it has found an unguarded flank. They were not looking at the ridgeline, they were looking at Scipio's cohorts, already calculating the angle of impact. Hortensius watched for another 30 seconds. Then he made the decision that Sulla had trusted him to make. Forward, all cohorts, move.
5 cohorts of Roman infantry coming over a ridgeline they had been hiding behind all morning produced a specific effect on the Pontic cavalry that had nothing to do with the number of soldiers involved. 5 cohorts, approximately 2,500 men, was not, by itself, sufficient to stop 10,000 cavalry in open ground. The mathematics did not support it. But the mathematics assumed the cavalry saw them coming. The Pontic horsemen were at full extension when Hortensius's cohorts crested the ridge, fully committed to the envelopment, moving fast, organized around a direction of attack that had no room in it for a threat from a completely different angle. The riders on the outer edge of the formation saw the Roman infantry appear on the ridgeline to their right and processed what they were seeing in the way cavalry processes unexpected infantry at close range, with a violence of instinct that had nothing to do with rational assessment. They turned. Not all of them, not in any coordinated way. The outer edge of the Pontic cavalry formation turned toward the new threat, and in turning, it ran into the ranks immediately behind it, which were still moving forward toward Scipio's cohorts, which had not yet received the information that the situation had changed. 10,000 horses attempting to move in 2 different directions simultaneously in a confined space produced what 10,000 horses always produce under those conditions: chaos. The outer ranks pushed inward. The inner ranks, compressed against the forward movement of the main body, had no direction available except forward, into the Pontic infantry formations they had been advancing past, into the soldiers who had been watching the cavalry charge with the professional detachment of infantrymen who know the horsemen are someone else's problem. They were now everyone's problem. Pontic cavalry driving into Pontic infantry, horses that could not stop, riders who could not turn, infantry that could not move fast enough to clear the space that 10,000 panicking animals suddenly required. The formation that Archelaus had committed to a clean envelopment of the Roman right had become, in the space of 90 seconds, a catastrophe of his own making, his cavalry destroying his infantry's cohesion from the inside, while Hortensius's 2,500 men came down from the ridgeline at a controlled pace and hit the compressed, confused mass from the outside.
"Pull the cavalry back. Get them clear of the infantry." His adjutant relayed the order. The order reached the cavalry commanders. The cavalry commanders looked at the situation around them. Horses pressing against infantry, pressing against horses. No clear direction, no clear space. The Roman cohorts closing from the ridge, and discovered that pulling back was not currently an available option. You could not pull back through your own infantry, not at speed, not when the infantry was already disrupted by the horses that were supposed to be pulling back. Sulla watched the Pontic right dissolve from his command position, and felt not triumph, but the cold, precise satisfaction of a man watching a mechanism function exactly as designed. He had placed Hortensius behind that ridge for one purpose, not to stop the Pontic cavalry, but to turn it, to use its own momentum and mass against the formation it was supposed to be protecting. Every horse that panicked was a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. Every Pontic infantryman knocked aside by his own cavalry was a soldier who was no longer holding a sarissa. The plan had three parts: the trenches, the broken ground, the hidden cohorts. All three had worked. What remained now was the question of whether Archelaus understood yet what had happened to him, and whether understanding it would come in time to change anything.
Archelaus was moving through the dust, trying to find his cavalry commanders, when he heard the sound of fighting to his immediate left. Close, very close. He turned toward it with the instinct of a commander who moves toward trouble, because moving toward trouble is what commanders do. What he found in the dust was a mass of soldiers moving toward him at speed. He could not see their equipment clearly. He could not hear their words over the noise of the battle. He could see only that they were moving fast, in disorder, in a direction that suggested they were being pushed by something behind them. Archelaus, "Stand and fight! Turn and hold the line!" The soldiers did not stop. They moved past him and around him, and the dust closed behind them, and he was left standing in the middle of a retreat he had ordered no one to make. He understood then what he was looking at. Not a Roman advance. His own men, running, separated from their units, operating entirely on individual instinct in a cloud that had made the concept of a formation meaningless. He had not lost control of his army. His army had lost the ability to receive control. It was no longer a force. It was a crowd of armed men in a dust cloud, each one making individual decisions that had nothing to do with any plan Archelaus had ever made. The army that had numbered 120,000 at dawn was still, technically, mostly alive, but it had ceased to function as an army somewhere in the dust of the Chaeronean plain, and functioning as an army was the only thing that had made it dangerous.
The dust came from the ground itself. Greece in August is dry in a particular way, not the loose sand of a desert, but compacted earth that has spent months baking under a Mediterranean sun until it has the consistency of powder just below the surface. 150,000 soldiers moving across it, fighting on it, falling onto it, being driven across it by horses and panic and the specific violence of a battle that had stopped making sense. All of it produced a cloud that rose from the plain of Chaeronea and swallowed the battle whole. By the time the Pontic cavalry had finished destroying its own infantry's cohesion, visibility on the eastern side of the battlefield had dropped to perhaps 30 meters, sometimes less. A man could see the soldiers immediately around him and the vague shapes of movement beyond them, and nothing else. The plain, the hills, the Roman line, the Pontic formation, all of it dissolved into a uniform brown haze that moved and shifted with a faint wind and revealed nothing. In that haze, the battle stopped being a battle. It became something else. The Pontic army was not a homogeneous force. This had been its strength. Drawn from across the eastern Mediterranean, it combined Armenian heavy cavalry, Cappadocian infantry, Greek mercenaries, and soldiers from a dozen smaller peoples who had fallen under Mithridates' expanding influence. Each component brought different skills, different equipment, different strengths, different languages. In open ground, with clear sight lines and established formations and commanders who could see their men and be seen by them, the diversity was manageable. Orders moved through interpreters. Units operated in their own languages within their own sectors. The coordination was imperfect but functional. In a dust cloud, with formations broken and cavalry mixed into infantry, and the entire eastern half of the battlefield reduced to shouting shapes moving in uncertain directions, it stopped being functional entirely. An Armenian cavalry officer, separated from his unit, heard movement in the dust to his left and shouted a command in Armenian. The shapes moving did not respond. He shouted again. The shapes kept moving toward him, which in the context of the last 20 minutes of his experience meant one thing. He attacked. The shapes were Cappadocian infantry retreating from the pressure of Hortensius's cohorts. They heard cavalry coming at them from the dust and responded the way infantry responds to unexpected cavalry, with the particular desperate violence of men who cannot run fast enough. They fought each other for approximately 4 minutes before enough of the dust shifted to reveal the situation. By that point, it did not matter. The damage was not measured in casualties. It was measured in the complete destruction of whatever remained of unit cohesion on the Pontic right. There is a moment in every collapsing battle when the commander on the winning side faces a choice. He can manage the collapse from a distance, direct, coordinate, preserve himself for whatever comes after. Or he can enter it, put himself into the chaos personally, become part of the force rather than the mind behind it, and trust that his presence in the right place at the right moment will do what no order transmitted through a rider can do. Sulla looked at the dust cloud consuming the Pontic right. He looked at the river behind the Pontic position, the Cephasus, running along the eastern edge of the plain, with its banks and the marshland beyond them offering nowhere useful to go. He looked at his last formed cavalry unit, fresh, unengaged, waiting on the Roman right flank for precisely this moment. Then he rode to them himself. His staff rode with him. One of them, a senior officer who had been with Sulla long enough to speak plainly without consequence, pulled alongside as they moved. Staff officer, General, if you go into that line personally and something happens, something is already happening. That is why I am going. He did not slow his horse.
The cavalry unit he reached numbered perhaps 800 men, not large but fresh, which in the context of what the rest of the battlefield had become was a more significant quality than size. Fresh meant formed. Fresh meant they could hear commands and respond to them. Fresh meant they were still an instrument rather than a collection of individuals making separate decisions in the dust. Sulla rode to the front of the formation. He did not deliver a speech. There was no time for a speech, and the noise of the battle would have consumed most of it anyway. He said one thing, loudly enough for the front ranks to hear and for the front ranks to relay backward. "Follow me through. Stay formed. Everything in front of us goes to the river." He turned his horse toward the Pontic position and moved forward at a canter that became a gallop over the first 50 meters. 800 cavalry followed. What they hit was not a line. It had not been a line for some time. What they hit was the compressed, directionless mass of a Pontic army that had absorbed the chariot failure and the phalanx's disruption and the cavalry chaos and the communication collapse of the dust, that had taken all of these things and had not broken, technically, but had lost the internal structure that distinguishes an army from a crowd. A crowd cannot absorb a cavalry charge the way a formed line can. A formed line has depth, men behind men, each rank bracing the one in front, the whole structure converting the energy of impact into distributed pressure that the formation can hold. A crowd has none of this. It has only mass, and mass without structure simply moves in the direction of least resistance. The direction of least resistance was east, toward the Cephasus.
The effect was not violent in the way that individual combat is violent. It was something larger and slower, and in its way more terrible. The movement of an enormous mass of humanity being pushed in a direction it could not resist, toward a boundary it could not cross. The Pontic soldiers who had been fighting, and the ones who had been retreating, and the ones who had simply been standing in the dust trying to understand what was happening around them, all of them now moving east, pushed by 800 Roman cavalry and the momentum that 800 cavalry transfers to everything it touches. The river was not deep. Under normal circumstances, it was crossable. Under these circumstances, with thousands of men arriving at its banks simultaneously, pushing from behind against the men in front who could not move forward fast enough to clear space for the men behind, it became a barrier as absolute as a wall. Archelaus saw what was happening. He understood it with the specific clarity that comes to commanders in the moment when understanding is no longer useful. Archelaus: "Get to the boats! Anything that floats, get to the water!" There were not enough boats. There were never going to be enough boats. The army that had arrived at Chaeronea with 120,000 soldiers was dying not from Roman swords alone, but from its own weight. The accumulated mass of a force too large to maneuver, too diverse to communicate, too confident to have prepared a line of retreat, pressing against a river that could not receive it. Sulla did not need to kill them all. He only needed to push. And he pushed.
The plain was quiet by late afternoon. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful, and what had happened on the plain of Chaeronea left a specific quality of silence in its wake. The silence of a place where an enormous amount of noise had been, suddenly and completely removed. The dust was settling. The river had stopped receiving what had been pushed into it. The last organized Pontic resistance had dissolved sometime in the early afternoon, and what remained was the aftermath, which is its own kind of landscape, familiar to soldiers and terrible to everyone else. Sulla walked it alone. The numbers, when his officers compiled them, were difficult to process, even for men accustomed to counting the cost of battles. Of the 120,000 soldiers Archelaus had brought to Chaeronea, approximately 10,000 survived to leave the field in any organized sense. The rest were dead, captured, drowned in the Cephasus, or scattered across the Greek countryside in ones and twos, men who had simply run and kept running until the sound of the battle was no longer audible behind them. The scythed chariots were wreckage. The phalanx had been broken on ground Sulla had chosen for precisely that purpose. The cavalry had destroyed its own infantry in the dust.
110,000 men gone in a single day on a plain in Boeotia. Sulla's own losses, the number he reported at least, were 12. 12. He knew when he gave that number that no one who had not been present would believe it entirely. He did not expect them to. The number was almost certainly compressed by the particular arithmetic that victorious generals have always applied to casualty reports, the unconscious rounding that turns a difficult truth into a cleaner story. The real Roman losses were low, genuinely, historically low, in a way that the physical evidence of the battlefield supported. But 12 was a figure chosen for its effect as much as its accuracy. It was the number of a battle that had not been fought. It was the number of a trap, not an engagement, which is precisely the point Sulla wanted to make.
He found a wounded Pontic soldier near the bank of the Cephissus as the light was failing. A young man, Greek by his equipment and his accent, one of the mercenaries Mithridates had recruited from the cities of Asia Minor with promises that had seemed more credible before this morning. He had a wound to his leg that would heal if it was tended to, and he was looking at the river with the expression of a man cataloging everything he had lost. Sulla crouched beside him. "Can you walk?" The soldier looked at him, recognized after a moment what he was looking at. Pontic soldier: "You are Sulla." "I am. Can you walk?" "Why does it matter to you?" Sulla looked at the river, at the evidence of the afternoon on its banks. "Because the battle is finished. What happens after the battle is a different question." He called for water and had the man's wound bound. Then he stood and walked back into the plain without waiting for a response.
What Chaeronea meant, what it would mean across the centuries that followed, was not immediately obvious to the men who had fought it. Significance of that scale takes time to become visible. But the outline of it was there, in the wreckage of 80 scythed chariots and the broken geometry of a phalanx that had walked onto the wrong ground, and the river that had received what Sulla's hammer had pushed into it. 50 years later, military men studying the engagement would identify 3 principles that Sulla had applied with a precision that bordered on the surgical: preparation of the ground before the battle, neutralization of the enemy's decisive weapon before contact, concealment of reserve force until the moment of maximum effect. None of these principles were new. Sulla had simply applied all 3 simultaneously against an enemy that had not imagined they were necessary. A century after that, Roman officers at military academies would use Chaeronea as a case study in what they called the economy of violence, the idea that a battle won through engineering and positioning costs less than a battle won through attrition, and that the general who shapes the ground before the fighting begins has already won something the enemy cannot take back. 2,000 years later, the plain of Chaeronea is quiet farmland. There is a stone lion near the site, erected centuries ago to mark a different battle fought on the same ground, a Greek defeat against a Macedonian king. It has stood through Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, watching the plain change and stay the same. The trenches Sulla dug are long gone. The ground has absorbed them. But the principle they demonstrated, that 30,000 disciplined soldiers with a prepared position and a precise plan can destroy 120,000 men who believe that size is sufficient, that principle did not disappear with the dirt. It was written into the ground at Chaeronea in the summer of 86 BC. It has been read by generals ever since.